All right, what's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we just got our first look at Parker Robbins. Technically, we got it yesterday, but we got our first look at Parker Robbins, aka The Hood. And I have as many questions as I do just being giddy and excited about his character, because I love The Hood. The Hood is one of these characters in Marvel Comics, right? Parker Robbins, he's one of these characters in Marvel Comics where he's just like a villain of the week who's always trying his best to be the top guy, but can never quite make it, but he always has like just these insane moments, right? Just these insane feats that he's pulled off. So for perspective about this, to give you guys some examples, in the old solo series of The Hood by Brian K. Vaughan, he basically stole or at least stole his red hood and his boots, kind of his iconic outfit. He stole that from a demon that had just kind of appeared in the middle of a seance because him and his cousin John King thought they were breaking into a warehouse to steal some magical artifacts. The guy was obsessed, right? Like Parker Robbins was obsessed with the idea of becoming a villain. He loved that idea. But when he stole those, he didn't realize it at the time, and even we as the reader didn't know. It was something that was established by Brian Michael Bendis in his New Avengers run, that basically Parker Robbins was imbuing the power of Dormammu. It didn't make him godlike. It gave him a kind of passing knowledge of magic and mysticism. Most of his magical abilities derived from the hood and the boots itself. So like the boots allowed him to walk on air. The hood gave him the ability to go invisible or to shoot like energy blasts, different things like that, right? Like resurrecting the dead, things along those lines. And a lot of those come from the actual Hood story itself. But in New Avengers Volume 1, issue number 56, he got the Norn Stones from Loki. The Norn Stones are a little finicky, right? So what they can do is contingent based on two things. One, that the Norn Stones accept the person that picked them up. If Parker Robbins had picked up the Norn Stones and the Norn Stones were not receptive to him, they would have just been random pieces of rock and that would have been it. Such as it was, when he did take the Norn Stones, then they allowed him to basically fulfill his own individual wishes. That's the second caveat of the Norn Stones. They do not have a definitive ability, right? They're not like the Infinity Stones, which we'll talk about here in a second, because Parker Robbins did get the Infinity Gauntlet at one point in time. That the Norn Stones themselves basically grant wish fulfillment. So they will allow the person to become whatever it is they wish to become. So a really good example of this is that with Parker Robbins, he ended up becoming basically like super rich, wildly capable, all that kind of stuff, right? He was a very, very capable and interesting character. Contrast to that, you had like Thor. While he did become interesting, the idea behind Thor's motivation in gaining the Norn Stones was to basically defeat the beings called those who sit above in shadow, who are responsible for the cycle of Ragnarok, the death and rebirth of Asgardians, seemingly over time. It was hypothesized they were Beyonders. We don't know for sure. Loki really hypothesized that during the final days of Loki's storyline, going into Secret Wars 2015. But basically, when Thor got the Norn Stones, he became Rune King Thor. He was a multiversal force. It was ridiculous how overpowered he was. It was very temporary, and he died at the end of that story, and then of course ended up coming back during J. Michael Straczynski's run. But the thing about this is that Parker Robbins has these really cool moments, right? Following the whole Norn Stone story arc and like all the money that he attained, that went directly into the New Avengers story, which was specifically New Avengers Volume 4, which was the run that came before the events of Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers run. But basically, he used his resources to attain 2 of the Infinity Stones. And the way that Bendis had reworked the Infinity Stones in Marvel Comics was that they desire to be together. So by attaining one, this led Parker Robbins to the others. And then once he attained all the others, he reformed the gauntlet. Now, of course, following that, it was taken by Iron Man, and then he essentially went forward and was just kind of Parker Robbins again. And Iron Man dispersed the stones among the Illuminati, who kept them for safekeeping, which explains how it was they had them at the beginning of Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers run when the incursion started. The point that I'm making here is that Parker Robbins is a guy who's very, very small time, right? He's a C-list villain at best, but he's a C-list villain that just kind of seems to be at the right place at the right time for a lot of these campaigns and ends up achieving like these just insane feats, but can never hold on to the level of power that he has. So it's one of those things where you kind of feel bad for him, right? Where you're like, man, he's really trying so hard. He's trying so hard to be this ridiculously amazing villain, but he just can't quite get there, right? Just can't quite get to that point. So he's one of those villains that you love to feel bad for. And as a result of that, fans love Parker Robbins. Oh, let me tell you something, man. You run up on a person who loves Parker Robbins and you're like, that guy sucks. Oh, they won't hear a word against him. They'll flip out, right? I mean, they literally tie their love of Parker Robbins into their identities, right? Like, if you don't like Parker Robbins, you don't like me, which doesn't really make any sense to me. But the point behind it is they love his character because he's interesting, right? He's really, really fascinating. Now, what role he will play in the MCU, that's the question to ask here, because there's a lot of potential for a character like him, but as we know with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they have a lot of potential with their villains, but they usually screw it up and they kill the villains off. It's just one of the biggest failings of the MCU. That failing is becoming more and more pronounced, and to be honest with you guys, I think that's going to spell the end of the Marvel Cinematic Universe if they don't get it together, because heroes are only interesting for so long. Villains are really the more interesting characters in comic books, right? Heroes are only as interesting as the villains they fight. And so as a result of that, when you look at Parker Robbins, he is just the total opposite of Riri Williams. Riri Williams is not based on magic and mysticism. If the leaks that have gone on here, which I'm surprised we haven't covered, and I feel like we need to, if the leaks that have come out with regards to Black Panther 2 are in any form true, then instead of Riri Williams being a girl who rose to prominence by way of reverse engineering Stark tech and building her own Iron Man suit, that instead she'll come to prominence by way of creating a device that locates vibranium across the world outside of Wakanda. That things are going to go awry, there's going to be some kind of an explosion, some of Namor's people are going to be killed, and that's going to lead to Namor the Submariner basically stepping in, and that's how he gets involved in the movie, and that's how you end up having this sort of animosity between Namor and the Wakandans. So there really isn't much in the way of any Iron Man involvement. But what this does do is it solidifies the greater role of Riri Williams, which is to say she is a being of technology and logic. And so it'd be really interesting if Parker Robbins does have magical abilities in the Riri Williams TV show, and they're kind of the opposite of each other, right? Where he's more magic, she's more technology, and those two don't necessarily mix. They kind of do, right? I mean, Thor talked about that in the first movie when he was talking to Jane Foster and saying that Jane Foster says there's magic, and then she says there's technology, and Thor says, I come from a place where basically it's a combination of both, magic and technology that are merged together to achieve a particular end or to do particular things, right? And so it'd be interesting if Parker Robbins represented that sort of opposite to Riri Williams. But beyond that, I think Parker Robbins has a lot of potential in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because one of the things that we don't know much about in the MCU is the nature of magic itself. That's one of the things to keep in mind. We know what we've been told by the Ancient One, and we know what we've seen with regards to Stephen Strange himself, but outside of Doctor Strange, magic is a hitherto unexplored concept in the MCU. It's still very, very new, right? I mean, Doctor Strange had the Book of Ashanti at one point. We don't know how much of that magic he's basically retained in terms of what he saw or what he absorbed from the book itself, before it was destroyed. His magical powers could be amplified. We have Agatha Harkness and her side of things. We've seen just how powerful a magical being can become. With regards to the Scarlet Witch, there's still the being of Chthon that hasn't been explored and has only been referenced. There's all kinds of stuff there, right? So one of the things to know is that when it comes to magic in Marvel Comics, that you do have an entire magical organization there, right? Like, you literally have bars, places where only those of magical power can access. You've got places like the Sinner's Market, which is like a flea market for magic where you sell your soul, or at least parts of your soul, to attain varying levels of power or magical artifacts or different things like that. There's a whole other side to this that has never been explored. So while I wouldn't go as far as to say that I think Parker Robbins is a character that's going to have direct ties to Dormammu, that his hood is somehow originating from Dormammu along with his boots, and that he's maybe a host for Dormammu and that's how he's gonna come back, I don't think that'll happen. I do think that Parker Robbins could be our gateway to sort of the quote-unquote ground level elements of magic, right? Where like characters like Luke Cage on Netflix, or Daredevil, or Jessica Jones, or that garbage ass Iron Fist show, where those were our sort of link to like ground level superheroes fighting ground level crime, more of a tangible and relatable hero, that Parker Robbins could be that for magic. I don't know if that's going to be the case. I really think it could be, and I think it'd be awesome if it was, but my biggest fear is the same fear that has always been when it comes to interesting villains introduced into the MCU, that at the end of the Riri Williams TV show, they're going to kill Parker Robbins off. off, and then they're gonna have another villain that's gonna come in. Again, it's just kind of an all-important lesson that the Marvel Cinematic Universe just hasn't learned. And it's the biggest failing of the MCU up to this point, which is killing their villains, as opposed to recognizing the villains are almost always more interesting than the heroes. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Thank you guys for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments section about Parker Robbins, and I will catch you all later. Peace.